Okay, perfect. There we go. All right. Yeah, hello and welcome back. How can I navigate with this? All right. So, sorry, one more thing I gotta check. I just realized I have to make sure the sound is on. I see audio capture. It looks good. Okay, perfect. Everything's working. I like it when that happens. All right, so, couple minor things. I'm almost done the midterm. I worked on it diligently all weekend, but I didn't quite finish. So grades should be up. I hope. I would love to say today, but realistically, I'm going to say sometime tomorrow, because my whole day is blocked off for working on it tomorrow. So they will definitely be up tomorrow, and I will get through it as quickly as I can. And I'm really sorry. I'm more on the 2 weeks side this time than the week and a half, which I hate, but there's nothing to be done. Just too many things going on. Okay, I think that's everything. I will definitely have those posted. If I have to stay up till 3 in the morning tomorrow to get it done, I will. I don't think that'll be the case. So, yeah, let's jump in. We'll do some more stuff. Okay, so last time we're talking about Stark's argument in secularization, RIP, right? So that's, okay. I realize I can't write on this I can't write in presenter mode. Okay, hang on. Duplicate slideshow. There we go. Now I can write on it, I think. Yes, all right. So, yeah, in secularization RIP, right? So secularization, rest in peace. Stark is making the argument that contrary to what has long been assumed in sociology, that secularization is not actually happening. And he suggests that the key error that sociologists have made was to take Europe as their guide, right? That Europe, because Europe, we tend to think it was super faithful, in the past, especially in the Middle Ages, and today, now it's secular. We tend to think, okay, something has happened, and the causal force here is modernity. So as we move through modernity, every society that moves along the same path as Europe has should ultimately go through that same process of secularization. However, as we talked about last time, probably I think one of the more contentious things that Stark suggests, but one for which I think the evidence is reasonably interesting at very least, is that Europe, was never as Christian as we tend to think it was. And, and he pulls this quote from Andrew Greeley, right? Again, another prominent sociologist of religion, that there could be no de-Christianization of Europe, right? There could be no de-Christianization because there was never any Christianization. And I'll explain that a little bit. Okay, so back to the pen. Basically, and we'll talk about this extensively when we talk about the rise of Christianity, Stark's book-length sort of treatise on this kind of subject. But one of the things that Stark suggests is that, we often sort of think of the establishment. I'll talk about Constantine in a second. The establishment of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century AD, as this moment where Christianity kind of triumphed, right? Where Christianity essentially went from, a minor religion in the Roman Empire, and with the help of kind of Constantine, who was the emperor, who declared it first a tolerated religion and then the official religion of the empire before converting on his deathbed, that basically this was the thing that launched Christianity into, the huge vitality, the superpower, and the dominance of medieval society that we tend to think it was. So, what Stark says, however, is that if we look from, roughly 33 AD to kind of about 321 AD, or maybe a little bit later, what we see in Christianity is actually a very, very vital religion, right? One that has a ton of energy, one that is actually conquering the Roman Empire, but without any state support. And Stark will say that you probably went from a group of about 100 people here to somewhere in the range of about 20 to 30 million by here, right? Which is a pretty colossal expansion. And this is all with sort of no state support, very little, and sporadic kind of persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. But he says that this all kind of grinds to a halt when Constantine makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. What you get is, on the surface, right, it's like, okay, now basically everybody is Christian because the empire is Christian, but the actual kind of trickle down to people is relatively low. So, why? Why does Stark think this? Well, he suggests that it's actually the adoption as the state religion that's responsible for sucking the vitality out of Christianity and making it, through the Middle Ages, a relatively low energy and lazy religion in lots of ways, right? It becomes very lethargic because, and I mean, we can go back to market theory, right? Essentially, Christianity becomes a monopoly religion. The priests, right? The priests, the bishops, end up all being paid by the state, right? So prior to this, if a priest, if a bishop was going to survive, they were reliant on the donations of their congregants, of people, to basically pay for everything, right? From their clothing to their food, to the buildings they met in, to pretty much everything. However, once it becomes the state religion, essentially everything gets paid for by the state, right? And so the priests, the incentive structure changes. The priests, the bishops, all get kind of lazy. They stop really going out, and evangelizing and trying to bring more and more people in. And what ends up happening is they stop trying to convert, the masses, and rather focus on the nobility. And there's this general pattern that we see, across societies. Take, for instance, the kingdom that was referred to as the Kievan Rus, right? So based in Kiev, you have Prince Vladimir, or Volodymyr, depending on who you talk to, who was, leading this kind of Slavic kingdom based in, what we would call modern day Kiev. And at one point, Volodymyr goes and he's like, okay, I want to convert to some other religion, right, away from the kind of Slavic pagan religion. And he converts to the Eastern Orthodox or Greek Orthodox kind of religion. And from that point on, everybody under kind of the rule of, the Kievan Rus is considered Orthodox. Now, did, peasants in far-flung villages at the far end of, this kingdom actually convert to Christianity? Probably not. Their lives probably remained relatively the same. But the nobility all converts, to keep favor with Prince Volodymyr. And, we see this pattern repeated over and over in different places in Europe, right? The ruler of a particular region converts to Christianity, and it's like, okay, now all of you are Christian, but the efforts to kind of actually trickle that down to the common people are relatively low energy and take a really, really long time. So what Stark suggests is that the role of Christianity in the lives of everyday people outside the nobility remained light and shallow. And this is how you can get a sort of argument that you can have, in a sense, kind of two Europes, right? You can have the Europe that built the great cathedrals, right? And all of the, all the great art, all the great monuments to Christianity, because that all comes from here, right? It all comes from the nobility. I mean, they'll tax the population to pay for it, but they're the ones commissioning it and paying for it. But you can also have, everyday people whose faith commitments are rather light and shallow. So they can still, sort of believe in witchcraft and pagan gods and, all sorts of things, maybe lightly Christianize it and keep going. Okay, and one of the examples he uses is, I talked about this last class, I know, the Scandinavian countries. And he says Christian commitment was never deep enough in Northern Europe to generate much attendance at Mass, so that when the Reformation hits, right, and Scandinavia is the last to be sort of Christianized. So when they decide after the Protestant Reformation that they don't want, to be beholden to the Pope anymore, Scandinavia easily becomes Protestant, right, with very, very little, no religious war, no pushback. And Stark says, not in these exact words, but because nobody really cared, right? The population wasn't particularly Christianized. And so, now, I see your question, I'll get to it in a second. This is also why, if you look today, the Scandinavian countries, right, those Northern European countries, are also, in Stark's mind, the ones that became secular and most deeply secular first, because they were never really Christianized. Yeah, please.
Sorry, just one clarification. So basically you're saying that because the rulers are Christian, it would just slow, like, only the ones closest to the rulers are Christian, and then the rest of them are kind of like,
Yeah, they don't really care, right? Which is why you get, in the big cities where the nobility are, these great cathedrals, but in the countryside, these churches that can't, seat the whole village, right? In the cities, you have great religious intensity, again, around the nobility, but in the countryside, right, people are, showing up and burping and farting and bringing their dog in and using the church as a cow barn in the winter because it's, got solid walls and it's nice and toasty. And yeah, but basically that's the argument that he's making. And again, there's nothing to say that this argument is correct, right? But it is one of the central kind of arguments when we talk about secularization. Okay, so this is 100% what we call a historically revisionist argument, right? That basically, and Stark is famous for doing this, he gives himself a lot of fanfare for it as well. There's lines in some of his books where he's like, historians had overlooked this fact until I came along, which historians don't always care for him doing that and sometimes criticize him for being like, yeah, but you're not using like our accepted historical methodologies. But Stark, being Stark, doesn't care. So he is revising history, right? He is taking what is sort of a settled version of history in some senses, that the triumph of Christianity was due to Constantine, the Roman Emperor Constantine. And saying, no, actually, Constantine is very much responsible for Christianity losing a lot of its vitality and slowing down, and its expansion and the depth of its expansion really weakening, right? So that it never permeated the lives of, the peasantry in a lot of these places, because his adoption made it lazy, right? It made it lethargic. And so this, quote, contrary to received wisdom, the conversion of Constantine did not cause the triumph of Christianity. Rather, it was the first and most significant step in slowing its progress, draining its vigor, and distorting its moral vision. And so, what Stark's case is, in a sense, was that Christianity, and especially Christianity's moral vision, right? So he says most of the evils associated with European Christianity since the middle of the 4th century can be traced to, I'm going to put this in like hot orange or something, establishment, right? So when we think of, all of the things that when the church and the state kind of get together and the church does a lot of bad things, sometimes on behalf of the state, and you can think here of all sorts of things, but you can think of, say, like residential schools. Stark's case is that, that comes from this distortion of Christianity's moral vision as it becomes an implement of the state, right? As it kind of gets really close to the state and becomes an implement of the state, it becomes sort of a tool for the nobility and spreading whatever power, politics they want it to spread. So again, nothing saying you have to believe this, but this is the case that Stark is making. All right. Good so far. I'm going to try to run through a few other things that Stark says kind of quickly-ish here. Okay. So one of the other things that Stark is going to make the case of is that a lot of what we think of as, secular societies are not. We think that maybe these are secular societies, and a lot of the exemplars that we think of as secular, he's like, actually, it doesn't make a lot of sense to think of them as secular. Okay, so one of the things he says, church attendance, right, which is often taken as a measure of religiosity, and therefore when church attendance drops, people start making the claim for secularization. And I think this is still the case. What Stark will say is that, well, church attendance might be low. There's nothing to say that in a society with low church attendance, that personal belief in something might remain high. Ooh, I don't want to highlight everything in red. Go back to yellow. All right, so he gives the example. And again, we're thinking of 2000. Things have changed a little bit since he wrote this piece. And if you look up statistics on Iceland, they have changed a little bit. But the case he was making here was that Iceland, right, had a weekly church attendance rate of 2%, around 1999. Based on Gallup World Values Survey data. So church attendance was relatively low, but still pretty high rates of baptism and almost all marriages taking place in churches. So, okay, let me run through the other things. 81% of Icelanders, right, so a solid majority said that they had confidence that there was life after death. 88% said they believe humans to have a soul. 40% believed in reincarnation. Not sure how all those beliefs fit together. And 82% said they pray sometimes or often. Do I have the fairy stuff? Okay, I don't have the fairy stuff. The other thing that he's... Okay, so the case that he's making here, right, is that this is a weird... so if 81% of people say there's life after death, 80% say they believe humans have a soul, and 82% say they pray sometimes, it's a weird society to call secular. Because while you might not have, particularly high church attendance, there does seem to be a lot of kind of religious belief or spiritualism, at very least, in this environment. And one of the things that he talks about in the piece too is that a not unsubstantial number of Icelanders also believe in fairies. And one of the things that you have to do, apparently, in Iceland, anytime you're going to build a new structure, is you have to have the property surveyed for, and I kid you not, fairy mounds, right? So the homes of fairies, to make sure that there are no fairies on the property that might be disturbed. And again, Stark says this would be a really, really weird thing to think of as secular. Okay. So, religion and science. One of the things that Stark also claims is that scientists are not notably irreligious, right? So they are not particularly irreligious. Among American academics, the proportion that regard themselves as religious is higher in the more scientific fields, right? So when we talk about biology, physics, and chemistry, right, those kinds of fields, it's higher in those fields. Oops, I can write good. The lowest are in anthropology and psychology, right? So it's actually in these social sciences that you find the lowest levels of religious belief. which is kind of an interesting thing. And I mean, I would put sociology there, right? Sociology would be right there too. And is this maybe because of the influence of folks like Marx, Durkheim, and Weber? Okay, so one of the things that Stark points to is this study that was done in 1997, and it's a repeat of a study that was done in 1914. So where basically they went and they asked, so again, this is now 27-year-old kind of data, but this is the case he's making in the piece. And again, things may very well have changed since then, but nobody has bothered to follow this up again. So so basically, they asked this kind of question, like levels of agreement with this statement, I believe in a God to whom one may pray in the expectation of receiving an answer. By answer, I mean more than the subjective psychological effect of prayer. I do not believe, I do not believe in a God as defined above. I have no definite belief regarding this question, right? So you could pick one of these three. Either one, you believe in a God that answers prayers. Two, you don't believe in God. Or three, you have no definite belief. And in as late as 1997, right, 40% of scientists roughly chose option 1, 45 chose option 2, and 14.5 chose option 3. Now, what the case that Stark's making here and why he thinks this is interesting, those numbers are essentially the same as they were when this same question was asked of leading American scientists in 1914. So why is this important, right? Why would this be, evidence of no secularization according to Stark? Because remember, right, it's supposed to be a trajectory. As we go in, further into modernity, we should have more secularism, right? So according to Stark, if, and scientists should have that scientific rationality that Weber's talking about the most, if, modernity and scientific rationality were the things dragging the gods into retirement, then we should see our physical sciences being the kind of leading indicator of this, right? That basically it should be, scientists should be the most secular, but what we see is actually no great difference between 1914 and 1997. Yeah, John. No, so this is like, what do you mean all? Like, you mean social scientists? No social scientists. This was natural sciences, right? That's natural sciences only. And this was, sent out to the membership of the American Academy of Science. So should be the leading scientists in the US. Okay, good? Yeah, please. Right, and they should be, he suggests, at the leading edge of that, right? Because if anyone's inculcated in scientific rationality, the way kind of Weber and Durkheim think they will be in modernity, it should be those engaged in the natural sciences, right? So we should see, if anything, we should see scientists less religious and getting less religious over time. And he says, they're kind of the same as they were in 1914. So can we really say that, ultimately, modernity and the increase in scientific rationality is driving secularization? He thinks probably not. Most of the scientists don't have the output. Like 45% said they don't believe, and 14% said they have no belief. Or they have no they have no definite belief regarding this question. Yeah. So again, he's more concerned with the change, right? Because he's concerned with this kind of temporal notion that secularization theorists have, that the further you move into modernity, the more secular you should get. And if, natural scientists haven't really changed much in, close to a century, and a little bit less than a century, can you really ultimately say that more modernity equals more secularization? And that's the kind of case he's making, right? That we should see this number going down, this number going up. And if we see them kind of relatively the same, then they'll probably have a different process going on. Something not altogether, secularization as, say, a Steve Bruce or an Emil Durkheim or a Max Weber would sort of contend. Oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Like, was there more expansion on this, or was it kind of like they could interchange using God as like a higher power? So it's like not necessarily like a figure of God, but it's like there's something greater than.
So this is exactly how it was asked, right? So they were asked to choose one of these statements, right? With no kind of like, yeah, there's a higher power, or, you know, something started the universe, but then wandered away and is, I don't know, playing with other universes or something like that. So it's a relatively limited question set for sure. Yeah.
What is, if even if there's not much difference between 1914 and 1997, what is different? Did it get more secular or did it get less?
It's a little bit, like this number is up a little bit. Like, so if this 45.3, if I recall, is up just a little bit. And this number is down, but just a little bit. It's like, I believe 1 or 2% though. Like, it's not a huge statistical difference based on, you know, again, it's the case that Stark is making. So, all right, good to move on? Okay. All right, so I'm going to give you some other examples. We're going to leave secularization rip and move on to this, which he wrote in 2015. So he kind of updates, you know, builds on the argument in secularization rip, or rest in peace secularization. And he then, and in the Triumph of Faith, kind of takes us on a global tour, basically with the goal to say, you know, to show how religious the globe still is, right? You know, and you can see the subtitle of the book, even though it's on top. You know, by 2015, he's, you know, the Triumph of Faith, why the world is more religious than ever. Now, most of the data here is from the the Gallup World Values Survey, which is conducted, and they were still running this, but it's run in 163 countries globally. Okay, so in the book, he makes a couple of really important distinctions. So he is going to talk about the supernatural, right? Refers to forces or entities beyond or outside nature and having the capacity to suspend, alter, and ignore physical forces, right? So not altogether different than, say, the definition that Smith gives a few years later when he writes, you know, religion, what it is, how it works, and why it matters. A little bit different, but still somewhat similar, right? Suspend and alter physical forces, entities beyond or outside nature. So what he says is, so you can have beliefs in the supernatural. Common forms are, you know, supernaturalism, astrology. Oh, there should be a comma there. Astrology, spiritualism, and fortune telling. And he says religion is a form of supernaturalism that postulates the existence of gods or conceives of supernatural beings having consciousness and desires. Now, I don't love this definition. I actually prefer Smith's definition, which obviously is why we spent like a week and a half on it. But this is the definition that Stark is going for in this piece. Now, I think more important than this is these two definitions, because his argument here really hinges on this very important distinction, and this is one that he suggests a lot of social scientists fail to make. Okay, and this is between what he calls churched religions. And again, this is not just Christianity, Islam, Judaism, probably, you know, Hinduism to some extent, Sikhism would probably all fit to some extent within this definition. But a church religion, right? Relatively stable, organized congregations of lay members who acknowledge a particular religious creed. That is a churched religion. And what is a creed? A set of beliefs to which all members of a religious group are expected to assent, right? So, you know, whether it's something as straightforward as, you know, there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet, right? That's a creed within Islam. Or, you know, something like the Apostles or the Nicene Creed in Christianity, right? These are kind of codexes of belief, and they can be super short, they can be super long, but they are things that all believers in that religion are expected to kind of assent to. Okay. And those typically who participate in church religions are expected to do so regularly and exclusively, right? So, I mean, when we think of this, this fits really well with the sort of Western experience of religion, right? Because it fits really well with Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which would have been, the religions that the West has been most familiar with for the longest, and certainly that have dominated, the Western part of the globe, Europe, North America, and the Middle East. So, the idea that you have to, if you're Jewish, you keep the Sabbath, pray, I want to say 3 times a day for the restoration of the temple. I guess if you're an Orthodox Jew. In Christianity, that you attend church on Sundays, and depending on the version of Christianity, that you do some other things. And Islam, right, that there's all sorts of things like 5 times daily prayer, prayers on Friday, doing the Hajj once in your life, keeping Ramadan, right? This would all be, kind of what we would think of as churched religions. However, the other category that Stark is going to want to talk about, and he thinks the thing that often gets missed in a lot of sociological discourses about religion is that he thinks there's this whole other category of religions, which he calls unchurched religions, right? Or unchurched supernaturalism, that lack things like organized congregations. They usually lack a defined creed, and there's no particular expectation of doing certain actions in a sort of time-bound fashion, right? Okay. My live stream is cropped weirdly. Oh, it altered itself after I said it. Did that to me the other day too. I wonder if it's the update for OBS that did that. All right, it should be fixed now. Okay. Did I go the right direction? Okay, I did. All right, so, huzzah. All right, so the World Values Survey. In the World Values Survey, so this is globally, and again, this is probably about 2014, 2012, so about a decade ago. 81% globally claim to belong to organized religious faiths. 74%, say that religion is important in their daily lives. Half reported attending a religious place of worship in the last 7 days. Over half believe God is directly involved in things that happen in the world. And in very few nations do atheists exceed 5%. And he said only in Vietnam, China, and South Korea do they exceed 20. I think today you'd have to add Czechia to that list. Maybe the Netherlands. I might be running right around there. They may have jumped in there more recently, but still, like a relatively small number of people consider themselves atheists. And certainly, like if you count, I guess you probably put North Korea there too, though it's hard to count them for anything, and we don't really know because we can't do research there. Vietnam and China are also officially communist, and both of them are hard to do research in, so it's quite hard to know what people actually believe. Okay, so global population numbers. Again, this is about a decade ago. 2.25 billion Christians, roughly, about 33% of the planet. About a fifth of the global population is Muslim, and then a little bit over 1 billion Hindus, and the rest is sort of change, with about 20% identifying as secular, a large number of those being in China. Yeah, Joan, what's up?
For Christians, does it count Catholic into that?
Yes.
Yeah, don't Christians and Catholic think like the other things, like you or something, or
There's a lot of Protestants that don't believe that Catholics are Christian. The other way doesn't typically go the other way. Catholics generally acknowledge Protestants as Christians, although kind of funny defective Christians, if I could put it in Catholic terms, right? Oh, silly, misguided little brothers, is sort of the Catholic attitude. But yeah, you do see, like official statistics, and nobody would count this, from a social science perspective. Catholics are definitely Christian from a social science perspective. On a theological level, I'll let Catholics and Protestants argue their own cases. I would put them together, and certainly, right, Catholics believe, well, I guess one of the reasons I would find it ridiculous would be sometimes the Protestant cases. Christianity sort of went away for 1,500 years until Protestants rediscovered it in 1517. So between like 400 and 1517, there were no real Christians, which I think is a kind of a stupid argument. Clearly, Catholics are Christian, and Protestantism is a sort of breakaway sect of Catholic Christianity. But yeah, so I think that I'm not super open to that line of Protestant argumentation. It would also include Eastern Orthodox and Coptic kind of Christians as well. Yeah.
For Jews, maybe like ethnic Jews or like maybe ethnic Jews or like religious Jews. Because there are people who are like ethnically Jewish, but they're like still full Jewish.
I'm assuming it's a kind of ethno-religious mix when it comes to Jews, because the line between those two things is a little bit difficult at times. But I'd have to look at how Gallup is actually asking that particular question. But a lot of secular Jews would still probably check the box of saying that they're Jewish, because it weirdly sort of, how to put this, being Jewish is both kind of a religious identity and an ethnic identity at the same time. And sometimes people will separate the religious identity from the ethnic identity. The other way does not tend to happen, but except in the case of maybe converts. It's hard to capture that on a social science survey, that level of kind of nuance. So my assumption is that this is probably, a mixture of religious and ethnic Jews, some of whom, and you'd have various levels of kind of belief within that mix. Does that make sense? Okay. But I don't know for sure. I'd have to actually go and like chew on the data, which I could do, but I'd have to look at how they ask the question. Okay. Active, right? So worldwide active religious, right? So this is measuring attendance and other things, right? We still see, 1.6. So you have a lot of inactive Christians, a smaller number of inactive Muslims, right? But of the kind of those who are religious, who are actively religious, right? Those percentages change a little bit. So again, and this excludes China, right? Because China is really hard to do research on, because they don't tend to like to let firms like Gallup go around and asking people about their religious identities in China, because it's supposed to be an officially communist state. And were you to discover, that actually a lot of people are still pretty religious in China, that could be very awkward for the Communist Party of China in lots of ways. Okay, what am I doing for time? Oh, 8 minutes. What a strange abundance of time I have. All right, so again, Stark loves his provocative claims. So let's highlight some of them. So what he says is, the world is far more religious today than it was in 1950. Amongst the things that he suggests, in 1950, there were probably only about 5 million Christians in China. And today, he suggests there's somewhere between 100 million and 250 million. Now, I've seen this number range anywhere, and I'm just going to write it down, in different accounts, somewhere between 60 to 80 million. At the outside, about 300 million. I don't find this number particularly credible. I think that's way too high. But somewhere in this range, right, and I think this is maybe a little bit low based on some of the other data I've seen. I think this number, 100 million is probably closer to where we are. And this would be, made really difficult by sort of sporadic persecution of Christians in China. The fact that a lot of Christians in China are part of underground churches that aren't officially recognized by the state. So they are really, really hard to count. And counting Christians in China has been difficult for decades. Under the kind of previous Chinese premier, I can't remember his name now. It was a little bit easier because they had relaxed some of the religious rules, but under the current Chinese leadership, it has become much more difficult, and they've cracked down on religion in major ways again. Okay, we'll talk about China a little bit more in a sec. So, the other thing that Stark says, and this is sort of inarguably true, church attendance in Latin America in the 1950s was about 20% of the population in the 1950s. It's over 50% today, and in some places, like if you take Guatemala as one example, it's closer to 80, right, in Guatemala. And this is largely driven by the influx of Pentecostals. Can't remember ever if Pentecost is spelled with an A or an E. I'm going to spell it with an A. Pentecostals that have sort of drawn in a lot of people, but also motivated the Catholic Church to do a much, much better job. And I mentioned this last time, Muslims today are more devoted than they were in the past. In a lot of places in the Muslim world, if you go back prior to the 1980s, Islam, in a lot of cases, was a fairly low intensity religion. Very similar, Stark says, to medieval Christianity, right? It was a monopoly religion, but one that wasn't like, it was, everybody said they were Muslim, but the actual levels of practice varied dramatically from place to place. But it's actually in the encounter with modernity, and particularly with forms of Western imperialism, that Islam has sort of revitalized in a lot of ways. Okay. So, again, this is about 2014. So, even in, even in Europe, people believe a lot of supernatural things. So, unarguable, church attendance in Europe is low. But one thing that Stark says is unconventional supernaturalism is thriving. And actually, unconventional supernaturalism seems to flourish precisely in those places where church attendance is low. And here, we can see, all of these countries, with the exception of Ireland, are countries that have relatively kind of low church attendance. We see, belief in fortune tellers, relatively high. Astrology. I love that like 42% of the Swiss are into astrology. That's fun. Lucky Charms, right? So not the cereal, but actually wearing some kind of medallion or something to bring you luck. And then if you look at Eastern Europe, right, astrology is really, really high. Lucky Charms and belief in, voodoo or not voodoo, but like that there are evil spirits and bad things that you can protect yourself with certain, charms and amulets, pretty high. And then, fortune tellers, pretty high as well. So even in places that we might consider secular because of low church attendance, Stark is saying these are all kind of weird supernatural beliefs for secular people to have, right? That you could go see a fortune teller that could tell you your future, or that astrology somehow works. That is, kind of odd. Oh, I cleared that already. Okay. Do I have time for Japan? No. How about I start? I'll start, because 3 minutes, I feel like 3 minutes is too long, and I got to get through Stark eventually. Okay, so Japan, often seen as a sort of prototypical secular country, because, in terms of church religions, according to Stark, there isn't much, right? There are very few Christians, very few, like maybe 3 Jews, no, maybe more than that, but not very many. And they all live at the Israeli embassy. And, not a lot of Muslims. But what Stark says is actual religious membership statistics add up to much more than 100%, because the Japanese often sort of play around with multiple forms of religious identity. So 90% of them visit Shinto shrines. Around 90% have Buddhist altars in their home. Only 11% say they're atheists. So Stark says the problem is we're measuring it by churched religion standards, and it's not a churched religion culture, right? It's a culture that developed a lot of forms of unchurched religion. And so when you ask people if they belong to a religion, they say no, because they're thinking of it in a different way. Culturally, right, the whole kind of idea is like, do you belong to a religion is itself a sort of Eurocentric way of asking the question. But when you break it down in different ways, they're actually quite religious. I'm going to take my 1 minute and do this slide. Okay, which I'll probably do again next time. What Stark says is Japanese life is actually drenched in religious practices. And he cites two, right? So when you buy a car, you drive it to the nearest Shinto temple to have it blessed, which is exactly what's happening in this picture. I found it on Google Images, right? It was not hard. Someone is having their Lexus blessed by a Shinto priest. And when you buy a property, there's a tax included to pay for a Shinto ceremony to purify the land spiritually. Again, what Stark is saying, that's kind of weird for a secular culture. Because why would you need to have a spiritual land cleansing or a spiritual purification if you don't believe in spirits or the supernatural or any of those things? It's just that we're thinking of it in the wrong way, right? We're thinking of it in church terms, but Japan has never been particularly strong in churched religions. And I've now used all my minutes. So we'll come back, we'll finish this on Wednesday, we'll finish Stark on Wednesday, maybe not. And then we'll talk about we have two more models of secularization to go. And then we'll just keep going. It'll be fun, I hope. This pen works much better than my other one, so that's great. No, I will do that when I go upstairs. Hiya! All right, c'est pas beautiful, ça. I'm hoping tomorrow. I have my whole day tomorrow blocked off to finish marking the 20 I have left. So I'm hoping tomorrow. I would have said today, but I don't want to lie to people anymore.